Welcome to the Discourse Analyzer AI Toolkit, where articles come alive. You're listening to the audio version of our article. For the full text and an interactive experience, check out the link in the description below. Interact with any selection using our AI assistant to enhance your understanding. Let's explore.
Environmental issues in discourse analysis. Interactive assistant environmental issues encompass a range of concerns related to climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, deforestation, and sustainability. In discourse analysis, environmental issues are studied to understand how language shapes public perception, frames environmental policies, and reflects ideological positions on topics such as conservation, energy use, and environmental justice. Discourse analysis of environmental issues explores how various actors, governments, corporations, activists, and media use language to construct narratives about the environment, mobilize public opinion, and influence policymaking. By examining the language used in political speeches, news media, corporate sustainability reports, environmental activism, and public debates, discourse analysis reveals how environmental issues are framed, how competing interests are negotiated, and how power relations are embedded in discussions about the environment. Through this lens, researchers can uncover the ways language reflects societal attitudes toward nature and environmental responsibility, and how these attitudes shape actions and policies. Key features of environmental issues in discourse analysis. 1. Framing environmental problems. Framing refers to the way environmental issues are presented and defined through language. Discourse analysis examines how different stakeholders, e.g., governments, corporations, activists, frame environmental problems to align with their interests or ideologies. Example: climate change can be framed as an urgent global crisis, as seen in phrases like, "We are facing an unprecedented environmental catastrophe that demands immediate action," or as an economic challenge, with statements like, "Mitigating climate change will require balancing economic growth with sustainability." Discourse analysis would explore how these different framings affect public perception and policy responses, highlighting the competing priorities at play. 2. Rhetorical strategies and persuasion. In discussions about environmental issues, various rhetorical strategies are used to persuade audiences. Discourse analysis looks at how language appeals to logic, logos, emotion, pathos, and credibility, ethos, to convince the public, policymakers, or consumers of the importance of environmental action. Example: an environmental advocacy group might use pathos in a campaign with phrases like, "Our children's future depends on the choices we make today," appealing to emotions like fear and hope. Discourse analysis would examine how emotional appeals are used to foster urgency and moral responsibility, influencing public engagement with environmental causes. 3. Scientific discourse and expertise. Scientific discourse plays a central role in discussions of environmental issues, with experts often providing data and evidence to inform policy decisions. Discourse analysis investigates how scientific language is used to communicate complex environmental problems, and how this language is interpreted or contested in public discourse. Example: in climate change reports, phrases like, "The evidence shows a 1.5 degrees Celsius rise in global temperatures," provide scientific authority and precision. Discourse analysis would explore how such technical language is used to legitimize environmental arguments and how it may be simplified or misrepresented in media or political discourse. 4. Environmental policy and power relations. Environmental discourse often reflects power dynamics between different stakeholders, such as governments, corporations, and marginalized communities. Discourse analysis examines how language in environmental policies reinforces or challenges existing power structures and whose voices are prioritized or marginalized in environmental decision-making. Example: a government policy might use language like, "We are committed to reducing carbon emissions while protecting jobs in traditional energy sectors, balancing environmental and economic concerns." Discourse analysis would investigate how the language reflects the power dynamics between environmental advocates and industry stakeholders, and how policies prioritize certain interests over others. 5. Corporate sustainability and greenwashing. corporations increasingly engage in sustainability discourse to demonstrate their commitment to environmental responsibility. Discourse analysis can reveal whether this language genuinely reflects sustainable practices or is a form of greenwashing, where companies exaggerate their environmental efforts to improve their public image. Example: a corporate sustainability report might state, "We have reduced our carbon footprint by 20% over the past 5 years, while downplaying ongoing environmental harm." Discourse analysis would examine how the language selectively highlights positive actions and omits negative impacts, contributing to a narrative of environmental responsibility that may not reflect the company's overall practices. 6. Environmental justice and equity. Environmental justice focuses on the fair distribution of environmental benefits and burdens, particularly for marginalized communities disproportionately affected by environmental degradation. Discourse analysis looks at how language reflects or obscures issues of equity and justice in environmental debates. Example: activists might use phrases like, "communities of color are on the front lines of climate change," highlighting the disproportionate impact on marginalized groups. Discourse analysis would explore how this language centers social justice in environmental discourse and how it contrasts with broader, more generalized discussions of environmental impact. 7. Media representation of environmental issues. The media plays a critical role in shaping public perceptions of environmental issues. Discourse analysis of media coverage examines how environmental topics are framed, whose voices are amplified, and what narratives are constructed around events like natural disasters, climate change, or conservation efforts. Example: media outlets might describe wildfires as devastating acts of nature, or the result of poor forest management, depending on the political context. Discourse analysis would investigate how these different narratives reflect ideological positions and influence public understanding of environmental responsibility and policy. Methods for analyzing environmental issues in discourse. 1. Critical discourse analysis, CDA. Critical discourse analysis, CDA, is used to examine how language in environmental discourse reflects power relations, ideologies, and social inequalities. CDA focuses on how environmental issues are framed to serve the interests of dominant groups, and how marginalized voices are included or excluded from the conversation. Example: a CDA of government environmental policies might reveal how language that emphasizes economic growth over sustainability reflects neoliberal ideologies and prioritizes corporate interests over environmental protection. The analysis would focus on how power relations shape the language of policy and whose interests are represented or neglected. 2. Frame analysis. Frame analysis investigates how environmental issues are framed in public discourse, focusing on what aspects are emphasized and what is downplayed. This method examines how different stakeholders, e.g., policymakers, activists, corporations, use framing to shape public perception and influence policy decisions. Example: in debates about renewable energy, one side might frame it as a job-creating industry of the future, while opponents frame it as costly and unreliable. Frame analysis would explore how these different framings influence public opinion and policy outcomes by highlighting economic benefits or potential drawbacks. 3. Narrative analysis. Narrative analysis examines how environmental issues are constructed through stories, focusing on how different actors create coherent narratives about problems and solutions. This method is particularly useful for understanding how climate change, conservation, or environmental degradation is communicated to different audiences. Example: environmental NGOs might construct a narrative of urgent action to save endangered species, using language that emphasizes time sensitivity and responsibility. Narrative analysis would explore how this storytelling mobilizes support and frames environmental protection as a moral imperative. 4. Media discourse analysis. Media discourse analysis examines how environmental issues are covered in the news, including how headlines, imagery, and interviews contribute to the overall narrative. This method helps to reveal biases, ideological leanings, and the framing of environmental crises. Example: a media outlet might consistently refer to climate change as a controversial issue, rather than an established scientific fact. Media discourse analysis would explore how this language perpetuates uncertainty and influences public understanding of environmental science. Examples of environmental issues in discourse analysis. Example 1. Climate change in political speeches. A politician might say, "We must transition to renewable energy sources to protect future generations," framing climate change as a moral and generational issue. Discourse analysis would explore how this language appeals to responsibility and long-term thinking, while possibly downplaying the short-term economic costs of transitioning to green energy. Example 2. Corporate sustainability reports. A multinational corporation might publish a sustainability report stating, "We are proud to announce our investment in clean energy technology," while continuing to engage in environmentally harmful practices. Discourse analysis would examine how the language selectively highlights positive actions, greenwashing, and how it shapes the company's public image. Example 3. Environmental justice in activist discourse. An environmental justice group might use language like, "Indigenous communities have been the stewards of the land for centuries, and their rights must be respected in conservation efforts," centering indigenous knowledge and rights. Discourse analysis would explore how this language challenges dominant conservation narratives that often exclude marginalized voices. Example 4. Media framing of natural disasters. Media coverage of a hurricane might frame it as a natural disaster, or as a consequence of climate change, depending on the outlet's perspective. Discourse analysis would investigate how these frames shape public understanding of the event's causes and whether they emphasize natural forces or human responsibility. Example 5. Public discourse on deforestation. In a public debate, a government official might frame deforestation as an economic necessity for developing nations, while environmentalists frame it as an irreversible threat to biodiversity. Discourse analysis would explore how these competing frames reflect different priorities, economic development versus environmental protection, and how they influence policy decisions. Challenges in analyzing environmental issues through discourse. 1. Scientific complexity. Many environmental issues, such as climate change or biodiversity loss, are scientifically complex, and translating this complexity into accessible language can be challenging. Discourse analysts must navigate how scientific information is communicated, simplified, or distorted in public discourse. 2. Polarization. Environmental discourse is often highly polarized, with conflicting interests and ideological positions. Discourse analysts must account for how these divisions influence language use and the framing of issues, particularly in media coverage and political debates. 3. Multimodal communication. Environmental discourse often involves a combination of text, images, videos, and scientific data, e.g., charts, infographics. Discourse analysts must consider how these multimodal elements work together to construct meaning and influence public understanding. Conclusion. Environmental issues are deeply embedded in public discourse, shaping how societies perceive and respond to challenges like climate change, pollution, and conservation. Through discourse analysis, researchers can explore how language constructs environmental narratives, reflects power dynamics, and influences public opinion and policy. Whether examining political speeches, corporate sustainability reports, media coverage, or activist campaigns, discourse analysis reveals the complex ways in which language frames environmental problems, negotiates competing interests, and mobilizes action. Understanding the role of discourse in shaping environmental perceptions is crucial for addressing the global environmental challenges of today. Frequently asked questions. What does discourse analysis reveal about environmental issues? Discourse analysis uncovers how language is used to frame, interpret, and influence public perceptions of environmental issues. It shows how different actors, governments, corporations, activists, and media construct narratives, assert ideologies, and mobilize support for various environmental causes. How is framing used in environmental discourse? Framing refers to how environmental problems are presented and defined. For instance, climate change can be framed as a global crisis requiring urgent action, or as an economic challenge. Discourse analysis studies how these frames shape public perception and policy responses. What role do rhetorical strategies play in environmental communication? Rhetorical strategies such as appeals to emotion, logic, or credibility, pathos, logos, ethos, are often employed to persuade audiences. Environmental groups might use emotional appeals like, "protect our children's future," while companies may highlight data to demonstrate sustainable efforts. Discourse analysis examines these strategies and their persuasive impacts. How does scientific discourse affect public understanding of environmental issues? Scientific language lends authority and precision but can be complex. Discourse analysis investigates how such language is interpreted in public discourse, simplified for general audiences, or contested in media and political conversations. What can discourse analysis reveal about power relations in environmental policy? Discourse analysis highlights power dynamics by examining whose voices are prioritized in environmental policies and who benefits from certain framings. For example, policies might emphasize economic growth to favor industry, potentially marginalizing environmental advocates or frontline communities. What is greenwashing, and how is it analyzed? Greenwashing occurs when companies exaggerate their environmental efforts to enhance their image. Discourse analysis scrutinizes corporate sustainability reports and marketing language to reveal discrepancies between stated goals and actual practices, identifying selective positive framing. How does discourse analysis contribute to understanding environmental justice? Environmental justice focuses on equitable treatment and impact on marginalized communities. Discourse analysis studies how language highlights or obscures these issues, for example, by examining how activists frame climate change impacts on underprivileged groups versus broader environmental conversations. Why is media representation important in environmental discourse? Media shapes public perception by how it frames environmental stories, selects narratives, and emphasizes certain voices. Discourse analysis of media coverage can reveal biases, ideological stances, and the impact of framing on public understanding of events like natural disasters or conservation policies. What methods are used to analyze environmental discourse? Critical discourse analysis, CDA, examines power and ideological influences in language. Frame analysis investigates how issues are emphasized or downplayed. Narrative analysis studies the stories constructed around environmental issues. Media discourse analysis looks at how media portrays environmental topics, revealing biases and public influence. What challenges do analysts face when examining environmental discourse? Challenges include navigating scientific complexity, dealing with polarized debates, and integrating multimodal elements, e.g., visuals, text, data. Analysts must be adept at understanding how these factors interplay to create meaning in environmental communication.